Video we will look at the last two components. So we will spend very short period of time because as we discussed already, so majority of the aggregate demand is contributed from the consumption, which is 2/3, and then we look at investment, which take a large portion as well. The reason investment is so important because they are the one have the most change, so they are the one have the highest volatility. So it's most volatile component around these four. So the government purchase and the net exporting spending, net export spending, we will just very quickly go through because they are not the largest portion of the aggregate demand. So first, let's look at the government spending. So first, state and the local government are responsible for 2/3 of the government spending. So which means for the federal government, it only take 1/3 of the government spending. So most of the government spending is coming from the state and the local governments. So I don't think that surprise you. Like in this area, Erie, Edinburgh area. So in the winter, we have to have somebody clean the snow, and in the summer where somebody has to fill in the pothole, so people are got paid. So the people pay the bill are not the federal government, so they are actually is our state and the local government. So for the federal government, what are they doing? So usually they are doing the federal things like whatever happened in DC, the money spent there is covered by the government, is covered by the federal government. And also federal government will deal with the interstate highway. So if you see any car, maintenance car on the interstate highway, and usually they got paid by the federal government. So federal government. So that's you have to understand. Actually, state and the local government are responsible for the majority of government spending. So these governmental levels are not allowed to have a deficit. So consequently, their actions are pro-cyclical. So a decrease in consumption or investment will decrease tax receipts and the state and the local spending. So this decline in the state and the local spending will reinforce the original decrease in consumption and investment, and they will contribute to a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So this is very interesting. You have to keep in mind. So for our state and the local government, they don't allow to have deficit. So they don't allow to have deficit. So if they don't increase the tax, and then they cannot increase their spending. So they cannot increase their spending. And however, for federal government, so the U.S. government is allowed to have the deficit. Consequently, it can act to counteract any recession that a decrease in the aggregate demand may occur. So, which means if the state and the federal government decrease their consumption, but the federal government, since they can have deficit, so they can overspending, so that they can by overspending can boost the economy, try to push the aggregate demand to the right. So when they see the aggregate demand decreased, so that's the interaction between the inside the government spending. So what's the state and federal government spending, and what is the federal government spending? So the key here is who can have deficit, who cannot. So who can have deficit, who cannot. So the main reason the federal government can have deficit, one of the big reasons is because they can use this opportunity to help to boost the economy. So they will actively taking debts and creating a deficit in order to boost the economy. So this shouldn't surprise you. When we have the tax cut in the federal level, the income tax, so do you think that means the government going to reduce their spending? That's not the case. The reason they are reduce the income tax is really government try to boost the economy. Hopefully, it will help the economy in the long run. But during that year, the government actually will create a deficit. So learning this class, I want you to understand that having a deficit is not a bad thing. Having a deficit, if the federal government have a deficit, is not a big deal. However, if we have a huge deficit for a long period of time, so that will be a problem because the ultimate goal to having a deficit is try to help to boost the economy. If you keep taking debt, keeping having deficit, but nothing get improved, that means the policymaker has to change in their policy. You cannot keep using the same way to cure the problem, even you know it doesn't work. So this is about government spending. And so the next we will look at the net export. So number one, I want to emphasize is for the next export is equal to the export minus import. So you cannot flip with these two. So it has to be the export minus import will give you net export. So it's very easy to understand because export means the product produced in your country help you increase your employment rate. So that's good for your country. For the imports, it actually is produced in another country, so it only helps the consumption, but it will not help the development of the economy in the investments point of view. So that's why you're using something benefit for the nation minus something hurt the nation. So that's why you're using export minus import. So the level of the export depends on the expenditure by foreign consumers and the businesses. And so when the economy downturned in other land, lead to a decrease in U.S. export and vice versa. So that happened when when China are suffering, when their economy is not doing well. So they will reduce the import from U.S. regarding the soybean, regarding the aircraft. So decrease the export actually will hurt the U.S. economy and vice versa. And on the contrary, let's look at the U.S. economy. If U.S. economy downturned, and actually will lead to a decrease in U.S. import and vice versa. Like 2 years ago when the economy is not going well, or in 2008, so the U.S. actually cannot produce as many that they want because everything is so expensive. So that actually result in U.S. reduce their import, or reducing import because people have not enough disposable income to consume. So when we have the export minus import decrease, so we will see actually our aggregate demand will decrease because think about X minus M decrease. So more import than export, so our aggregate demand will shift to the left. So that's why you can think about the President Trump's policy. They could try to deal with the trade problem. And he said he hates so much trade deficit. So when we have huge trade deficit, and so we might see, I said we might see the aggregate demand curve is shifting to the left, which is far away from our full employment GDP. And what we can do is, as what he has done, is to try to reduce the import and increase the export so that you can shift in your aggregate demand curve to the right. So in that scenario, your X minus M is increasing, so your aggregate demand actually increased, and which will shift your aggregate demand to the right. And we see the scenario that when it can shift to the right, and it's more likely your equilibrium point will getting close to your full employment GDP. So this is the fourth component. So to summarize, so every aggregate demand curve will shift. The reason it shifts is not because it's shifting. It's really because four components are changed. Consumption is affected by the autonomous consumption and also the income dependent consumption, which means when income increase, when the expectation of the income increase, when the credits get in a good environment, which means you're easy to get credits, and your income tax decrease, all those behavior will create, all those policy will increase the consumption, which further will affect the aggregate demand, and will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And the second component is investment. So for investment, if investment change, it will also help to shift the aggregate demand curve. So the investment is affected by the expectation, interest rate, and technology. So when the expectation for a future sale increase, if the interest rate for borrowing is decreased, if the technology got advanced, all those scenarios will help to increase investment. So our investment function is a function of the interest rate, and actually will shift upwards, which will further increase the aggregate demand curve, and aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So this is our second component. And third component is our government purchase. So for the government purchase, you have to keep in mind, you have to understand the difference between federal government and our state and local government. State and local government, they cannot take on debt, so they cannot have deficit. So usually, if they don't collect enough tax, so usually they will reduce their spending, and then they will shifting their curve. They will in further shifting our aggregate demand curve to the left. However, for the federal government, they're allowed to take the debts. So using this function, they can actually help to shifting aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. And for the net export, and we have to understand that the net export is difference between the import and export. So you don't flip the import and export. So when this net export increase, and we will see we have more consumption made domestically, and so our aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. When net export decrease, we have less production happening in the domestic market, and what we see is aggregate demand curve shift to the left. So these are all about what affect our aggregate demand curve. So as I said, this week's discussion question is very interesting, and you will have chance to really using what we learned so far to analyzing the President Trump's new policy. So every policy he made, so which component will be affected, and eventually how will that affect the aggregate demand curve?